I am the cracked radio that heard the first man walk on the moon, Apollo 11 mission, and Neil Armstrong. I was born in a factory in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1968. My plastic casing was smooth then, unblemished by the years that would follow. The workers' hands assembled me with care, testing my speaker, adjusting my antenna, ensuring my dial moved with just the right amount of resistance. I remember the feeling of completion, the first time electricity flowed through. My circuits and my voice emerged clear and strong. I was destined for greatness, or so I believed then, with the naive optimism of newly manufactured things. By Christmas of that year, I found myself wrapped in festive paper, placed carefully under a pine tree, adorned with lights that reminded me of the small bulbs within my own circuitry. The hands that unwrapped me belonged to Thomas Mitchell, a 42-year-old science teacher from Houston, Texas. His eyes lit up when he saw me, a gift from his wife, Margaret. "Now you can listen to your space programs without bothering me," she had said with a laugh. Thomas kept me on his nightstand, my dial set almost permanently to the news stations that followed the space race. Through me, he heard reports of Apollo 8 orbiting the moon in December 1968, the first humans to see the far side with their own eyes. I remember how his breathing changed when the astronauts read from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve, broadcasting to the largest audience in history. In the months that followed, I became Thomas's companion during breakfast, my voice filling the kitchen with updates on Apollo 9 and Apollo 10, each mission a dress rehearsal for what was to come. I learned the language of spaceflight, lunar modules, command service modules, launch vehicles, terms that flowed through my speaker and became part of my identity. The day I cracked was April 13th, 1969. Thomas had carried me out to the garage where he was fixing his car. In his excitement to hear breaking news about the upcoming Apollo 11 mission, he knocked me from the workbench. I fell to the concrete floor and my plastic casing split along the right side, a jagged line that exposed part of my inner workings. My speaker was damaged, not enough to silence me completely, but enough that my voice now carried a distinct rattle, a metallic whisper behind every word. Thomas apologized profusely, running his finger along my wound. He could have replaced me. Transistor radios weren't expensive in 1969, but instead he wrapped electrical tape around my broken edge and placed me back on his nightstand. "Still works fine," he told Margaret. "Just has a bit of character now." I didn't know then that my imperfection would make me a witness to history in a way no pristine radio could ever be. By July 1969, the entire Mitchell household revolved around the Apollo 11 mission. Thomas brought me to the dinner table, where I shared updates on the launch preparations at Kennedy Space Center. His two children, David and Susan, ages 10 and 8, sat wide-eyed as I announced the names that had become familiar to us all. Neil Armstrong, Edwin, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. On July 16th, Thomas called in sick to work, the only time I ever knew him to do so. He set me on the coffee table in the living room, my volume turned up despite my crackling speaker. Margaret brought in sandwiches and lemonade as if we were having a picnic, and the family gathered around me like ancient people around a fire. T-minus 60 seconds and counting, I announced, my damaged voice adding a tremor of excitement that no perfect radio could convey. When the Saturn V rocket lifted off at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the announcer's voice rose in pitch, and I felt my circuit strain to carry the enormity of the moment. Thomas leaned toward me, his hand resting protectively on my cracked casing. The days that followed were filled with periodic updates as Apollo 11 traversed the 238,900 miles to the moon. I reported on course corrections, the separation of the command module Columbia from the Saturn V, and the health of the astronauts. Each night, Thomas would fall asleep with me beside him, my volume lowered but never off, as if he feared missing some critical announcement in the dark hours. On July 20th, the Mitchell family cancelled all plans. Neighbors dropped by throughout the day, crowding into the living room where I had been placed on a special tablecloth, my position of honor. My cracked speaker worked harder than it ever had, straining to clearly deliver every precious word from space. At 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I announced with my rattling voice, "The Eagle has landed." The room erupted in cheers. Thomas wiped tears from his eyes, and I felt a surge of electricity through my circuits, as if my own emotion had manifested physically. The wait that followed was excruciating. For hours, I relayed updates as Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for their moonwalk. Children dozed on the carpet, despite their determination to stay awake. Margaret served coffee to keep the adults alert. No one wanted to miss what was coming, least of all me. My damaged speaker had become an advantage. The metallic undertone I added to the broadcast somehow made it feel more authentic, as if the cosmic radiation of space itself was speaking through me. It was 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969, when my broken speaker carried the most important words I would ever transmit. The living room was silent except for my voice. Every eye was fixed on me, though I was merely the messenger. Through my cracked casing came the slightly delayed, staticky words from a man standing 238,900 miles away. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Peterson from next door began to sob, quietly. Thomas reached out and touched my antenna gently, as if thanking me personally for delivering this moment to his home. Through my damaged speaker, I continued to relay the descriptions of the lunar surface, fine and powdery, and the activities of Armstrong and Aldrin as they planted the American flag, collected samples, and spoke with President Nixon. For the next 2.5 hours, I never faltered despite my injury. My cracked speaker vibrated continuously, sometimes making the transmissions from the moon even more ethereal, adding a trembling quality to the astronauts' voices that seemed to capture the magnitude of what humanity had achieved. The children had long since fallen asleep on the floor, but the adults remained transfixed, witnesses through me to humankind's greatest journey. I remember Thomas saying something that night that I've kept in my circuits ever since. As the broadcast continued and the visitors began to drift home, he picked me up and said to Margaret, "Isn't it something? This little broken radio connecting us to men on the moon. Kinda makes you think about what's possible despite our flaws." The moonwalk ended at 1:11 a.m. on July 21st. The house emptied, lights were turned off, but Thomas kept me on, my volume low, throughout the night. Neither of us wanted to break the connection to that dusty plain, nearly 250,000 miles away. I stayed awake, my circuits humming, as Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the lunar module and prepared for their return journey. In those quiet hours, as the household slept, I felt more than a radio should be able to feel, a strange pride that transcended my manufactured purpose. My broken speaker had carried humanity's greatest triumph into this modest home in Houston, just a few miles from Mission Control, where the architects of this achievement were celebrating. My imperfection had not diminished my purpose. It had somehow enhanced it, adding a unique texture to history as it unfolded. In the days that followed, I continued to report on Apollo 11's return journey and the splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. Thomas carried me everywhere during those days, to the bathroom as he shaved, to the garden as he watered plants, even to the grocery store where the clerk smiled at the sight of a grown man cradling a cracked radio as if it were a newborn. The years passed, and I remained on Thomas's nightstand, though tuned to stations, with music more often than news. I reported on Apollo 12 through 17, my cracked voice announcing each moon landing with the same pride, though never again did neighbors crowd around to listen. The miracle had become routine too quickly, as human miracles often do. By 1977, Thomas's children were teenagers with their own stereo systems. David liked to tease his father about that ancient piece of junk on the nightstand. Once, Susan suggested replacing me, but Thomas refused. "This radio heard Neil Armstrong step on the moon," he said simply, and that ended the discussion. As the decades passed, I reported on shuttle launches and space station missions, my cracked voice growing fainter as my components aged. Thomas retired in 1992 and spent more time with me, sometimes turning my dial to find broadcasts about the Hubble Space Telescope or plans for future Mars missions. In 2012, I announced the death of Neil Armstrong. Thomas, now 85, sat on the edge of his bed, listening to my faltering voice describe the legacy of the first man whose footsteps I had transmitted. He ran his finger along my case, tracing the crack that had been there for 43 years. "We've both got our battle scars," he whispered to me. Thomas passed away in his sleep in 2018, 50 years after I first came into his life. 50 years after my speaker first delivered the news of humankind's greatest adventure. His daughter Susan took me home with her, placing me carefully on a shelf in her study. She rarely turns me. And now my technology is obsolete, my voice barely audible through my damaged speaker. But sometimes, on July 20th each year, she does. She tunes my dial carefully, listening through my static for any program commemorating that day in 1969. I am just a radio with a cracked speaker. I was manufactured to transmit the voices of others, not to have a voice of my own. Yet I have borne witness to humanity reaching beyond its cradle for the first time. My broken plastic has survived half a century, preserving within my circuits the echo of those historic words. Perhaps that is the lesson I offer, that imperfect vessels can carry perfect moments, that damaged things need not be discarded, that what matters is not the container, but what it holds. I am the cracked radio that heard the first man step on the moon, and though my voice may soon fall silent forever, the message I delivered will resonate for as long as there are humans to remember it. A reminder that even with our flaws, we can touch the stars.